Assalamu alaikum. We are going to talk about the pharyngeal apparatus. The pharyngeal apparatus is an embryological structure consisting of pharyngeal grooves from ectoderm, arches from the mesoderm, and pouches from the endoderm. The pharyngeal arches are formed by cells that are derived from ectoderm, endoderm, mesoderm, and neurocrest cells. Ectoderm lines the external surfaces of the pharyngeal arches. Ectodermally lined depressions between the pharyngeal arches are called the pharyngeal grooves. The development of the head and neck begins in the fourth week and fifth weeks of embryogenesis. Growth of mesenchymal tissue, the connective tissue, in the cranial region of the embryo results in the formation of arches separated by clefts or grooves. These are the pharyngeal arches and pharyngeal clefts. As you can see in this figure, these represent the pharyngeal arches. Here are the grooves or clefts separating between each two arches. A number of outpocketings appear on the lateral wall of the pharynx, the pharyngeal pouches. These pouches separate the arches on the internal or the endodermal surfaces, while the clefts separate the arches on the external or ectodermal surfaces. These represent the pouches lined by endoderm, and these are the clefts covered by ectoderm. They separate between each two arches. Also, you can see on both sides, since they are paired structures, these are the arches. This is the first one, second, third, and fourth. Between them, from the outside, these are the clefts or grooves. From the inside, these are the pouches. The pharyngeal arches begin to develop early in the fourth week as neural crest cells migrate into the future head and neck regions. As you remember, during neurulation process, during formation of the neural tube, when it is closed, these cells detach from this region. They are the neural crest cells. They start migration and forming certain structures. The first pair of pharyngeal arches, the primordium of the jaws, which are the maxilla and mandible, appear as surface elevations lateral to the developing pharynx. Soon, other arches appear as obliquely disposed, rounded ridges on each side of the future head and neck regions. By the end of the fourth week, 4 pairs of pharyngeal arches are visible externally. The fifth and sixth arches are rudimentary and are not visible on the surface of the embryo. The pharyngeal arches are separated from each other by the pharyngeal grooves or clefts. Like the pharyngeal arches, the grooves are numbered in cranio-caudal sequences. Here, these dotted arrows represent the migratory pathway of the neural crest cells forming these arches surrounding the neck region. This is the embryo where these arches are bilateral structures. As you can see, on the lateral surface of each side of the embryo they are apparent. This is the first, second, third, and fourth, and this is the pharynx. Here, the primitive mouth cavity, surrounded from above by the frontonasal prominence and the heart, and these are derivatives of the first pharyngeal arch, as the maxilla and mandible. This is the second pharyngeal arch, third, and fourth. Here again, lateral view of the embryo, the frontonasal prominence, the heart, and these are the pharyngeal arches. And this is a primitive mouth or the stomodium. The first pharyngeal arch, the mandibular arch, develops maxilla and mandible. The first pair of the pharyngeal arches play a major role in the facial development. The second pharyngeal arch or the hyoid arch contributes to the formation of the hyoid bone. Here again, these are the bilateral structures. This is the first pharyngeal arch, second, third, and fourth, lined by endoderm, covered by the ectoderm, and in between is the mesoderm. Pharyngeal apparatus consists of pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal pouches, pharyngeal grooves, and pharyngeal membrane. This is the site of the pharyngeal membrane, representing the approximation of the cleft and the pouch. Now, each pharyngeal arch gives certain components, and this is usually all of them are consisting of core of mesenchyme, covered externally by ectoderm, internally by endoderm. In the third week, the original mesenchyme is derived from the mesoderm, but during the fourth week of embryogenesis, most of the mesenchyme is derived from the neural crest cells that migrate into the pharyngeal arches. What happens later on to these structures? The pharyngeal arches contribute exclusively to the formation of the face, nasal cavities, mouth, larynx, pharynx, and neck. During the fifth week, the second pharyngeal arch enlarges and overgrows third and fourth arches, forming the ectodermal depression called the cervical sinus. At the end of the seventh week, the second to fourth pharyngeal grooves and the cervical sinus have disappeared, giving the neck a smooth contour. Here, this is the second pharyngeal arch. It's growing over the third and the fourth arches, leading to the formation of the cervical sinus, which later on disappears at the end of the seventh week. So the side of the neck will have a smooth contour. This is the first pharyngeal arch corresponding to this pouch, and this is the first pharyngeal cleft. This is the second pharyngeal arch, third and fourth. First pharyngeal arch cartilage. The dorsal end, the Meckel's cartilage, ossifies to form malleus and incus. The middle part forms anterior ligament, which is the sphenomandibular ligament. The ventral part forms the primordium of the mandible. Then the cartilage disappears as the mandible develops around. Here, these are the cartilages, that malleus and incus. This is the anterior ligament, and this is former site of the first Meckel's cartilage, and later on will disappear. These are the cartilaginous structures of the second pharyngeal arch, and later this is the third and fourth. Now, the second pharyngeal arch, the dorsal end or Richard's cartilage ossifies, forming the stapes and styloid process of the temporal bone. Ventral end ossifies to form the lesser cornea and the superior part of the body of the hyoid bone. Its perichondrium forms the stylohyoid ligament. These are the structure you can see. This is the cartilage of the second pharyngeal arch, and this is the third pharyngeal arch. This is the upper part of the body of the hyoid bone with the lesser horn, and this is the lower part of the body of the hyoid bone with the greater horn. Now, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth pharyngeal arches cartilages. The third arch cartilage ossifies, forming the greater cornea and the inferior part of the body of the hyoid bone. Fourth and sixth cartilages fuse, forming laryngeal cartilages except the epiglottis, developing from the hypopharyngeal eminence. Fifth pharyngeal arch is rudimentary. It has no derivatives. Now that the muscles of first pharyngeal arch forms muscles of mastication. Second pharyngeal arch forms the stapedius, stylohyoid, posterior belly of digastric, auricle, and muscles of facial expression. Third arch forms the stylopharyngeus. Fourth arch forms the cricothyroid and constrictors of the pharynx. The sixth pharyngeal arch forms the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. This figure shows the muscles of each arch. This represents the muscles of facial expression that are derived from the second pharyngeal arch. This color represents the muscles that arise from the first pharyngeal arch, and so on. This is the muscles of facial expression and muscles of mastication. This is the stylo-pharyngeal process that arise from the third pharyngeal arch, depending on the colorful sites, as you can see in this figure. These are the laryngeal muscles arising from the fourth pharyngeal arch. Here again, each color represents muscles that are derived from each arch. The green color represents the muscles that are derived from the first pharyngeal arch, and so on for the rest of the arches. Now, each arch has its own nerve supply. The first pharyngeal arch supplied by the caudal two branches of the trigeminal or the fifth cranial nerve, maxillary and mandibular. Second pharyngeal arch supplied by the facial nerves supplied and caudal fourth to sixth arches respectively. Third pharyngeal arch supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve or the ninth cranial nerve. Fourth to sixth supplied by the vagus nerve. Fourth arch supplied by superior laryngeal branch, whereas the sixth arch supplied by recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus. Here, as you can see, this is the fifth cranial nerve, supplies the first pharyngeal arch, and this is the glossopharyngeal nerve and glossopharyngeal nerve, lastly the vagus nerve. Now the pouches, there are four well-defined pairs of pharyngeal pouches. The pairs of pouches develop in a cranio-caudal sequence between the arches. Fifth pair is absent or rudimentary. Here you can see these arches. In between each two arches there is the cleft from the outside or groove corresponded by the pouches. The endoderm of the pouches contact the ectoderm of the pharyngeal grooves, and together they form the double-layered pharyngeal membrane, separating the pharyngeal pouch from the pharyngeal grooves or clefts. Here is the membrane. Here again, this is the first pharyngeal arch, this is the second, which is growing over the third and fourth, obliterating them, forming the sinus. Later on, this cervical sinus will disappear. The first pharyngeal pouch expands into an elongated tubo-tympanic recess. The expanded distal part of this recess contacts the first pharyngeal groove or cleft, where it contributes to the formation of the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. The cavity of the tubo-tympanic recess gives rise to the tympanic cavity and mastoid antrum. As you can see, this part represents the tubo-tympanic recess. The second pharyngeal pouch is largely obliterated as the palatine tonsils develop. Here, this is the site of the developing palatine tonsils. Third pharyngeal pouch expands and develops a solid dorsal bulbar part and a hollow elongated ventral part. By the sixth week, the epithelium of each dorsal bulbar part begins to differentiate into inferior parathyroid gland. Here, this is the inferior parathyroid gland. The epithelium of the elongate ventral part of the third pharyngeal pouch, which is the primordia of the thymus, proliferates and their cavities obliterate, and these bilateral primordia of the thymus, they come together in the medial plane to form the thymus gland, descending to the superior mediastinum. Here, This is the site of the thymus. It's elongating downward to settle down into the superior mediastinum. The third pharyngeal pouch, also that the primordia of the thymus and the parathyroid glands lose their connection with the pharynx and migrate into the neck, these two parts. Later, the parathyroid glands separate from the thymus and lie on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland. Fourth pharyngeal pouch expands into dorsal bulbar and elongate ventral parts. Also, its connection with the pharynx is reduced to a narrow duct, which soon degenerates. By the 6th week, each dorsal part develops into superior parathyroid gland. Here, this is the developing superior parathyroid gland. It lies on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland. The parathyroid gland, derived from the third pouches, descend with the thymus and are carried to a more inferior position than the parathyroid derived from the fourth pouch. As you can see, this is the inferior parathyroid gland, and this is the superior parathyroid gland. This explains why the parathyroid glands derived from the third pair of pouches are located inferior to those from the four pouches. Here, this figure shows this is the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, and this is the palatine tonsil. And here are these arrows show the direction of migration or the descending down of the superior parathyroid and inferior parathyroid glands on each side. During the 4th and 5th weeks, head and neck region of the human embryo exhibit 4 pharyngeal grooves or clefts on each side. Separate the pharyngeal arch externally. Only the first pair persists as the external acoustic meatus. Other grooves normally obliterated with the cervical sinus as the neck develops. Pharyngeal membranes appear in the floor of the pharyngeal grooves, which form where the epithelia of the grooves and the pouches approach each other. The endoderm of the pouch with the ectoderm of the groove or the cleft, soon separated by mesenchyme. Only first pharyngeal membrane becomes the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, the others will obliterate. Bronchial cyst, sometimes it occurs as a congenital epithelial cyst that arises on the lateral part of the neck, usually due to failure from an incompletely closed bronchial cleft, usually located between 2nd and 3rd bronchial arches. This is the clinical appearance at the lateral side of the neck. Here is its name, the bronchial cyst. Thank you for your listening.